Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, an Israeli officer critically injured in the so-called marches of return as the Hamas-run riots resume along the Gaza-Israel border. Meantime, the number of coronavirus victims seen and unseen rising ever faster in Israel as the fourth wave hits. And finally, the Tokyo Summer Olympics Part 2. Israel's Paralympic team getting stretched for the competition. Violent clashes with Gaza escalating sharply over the weekend. Israeli air forces retaliating against Hamas following renewed Palestinian attacks near the security fence that left an Israeli soldier and 2 Palestinians fighting for their lives. IDF fighter jets striking 4 weapons manufacturing and storage sites in Gaza overnight Saturday. No casualties reported, but the targets belonging to the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas, and the IDF claiming responsibility for the strikes as retaliation for heavy rioting in the days prior. In fact, hundreds of Gaza Palestinians arriving to the northern portion of the security fence with Israel, many attempting to scale the fence and breach Israeli territory, and others firing upon or throwing explosives towards Israeli forces on the other side. 21-year-old Israeli Border Police Staff Sergeant Barel Haderia Shmueli, for one, shot in the head and evacuated to hospital. He remains in critical condition. Footage on social media showing the rioters apparently trying to steal Shmueli's weapon before firing into his sniper hole with a pistol. Israeli forces, on the other hand, responding with riot dispersal means like tear gas and quote-unquote live fire where necessary. And Hamas-run Gaza health officials claiming 41 injuries, 2 of which are critical, including a 13-year-old boy who's similarly said to have been shot in the head. Still, the IDF expecting further violence, now bolstering forces around the Gaza border, including Iron Dome batteries, and concerns especially mounting as the weekend attacks come following the allowance of Qatari aid to flow into the Strip. This in efforts to support the ceasefire brokered last May between Israel and Hamas.
צבאית, אנחנו לא מקבלים שום התעצמות ופועלים בעוצמה מול פגיעה בריבונות ישראל. ומדינית, אנו מחזקים את הקשר עם הרשות הפלסטינית והגורמים המתונים באזור, תוך שאנחנו מאפשרים לפלסטינאים ברצועת עזה את התנאים ההומניטריים הבסיסיים הנדרשים להמשך החיים, לצד המשך המאמצים להשבת השבויים והנעדרים הביתה. כחלק מהמדיניות הזו, החלטנו גם לשנות ולשפר את מנגנון העברת הסיוע ההומניטרי של קטר לתושבי הרצועה, וזאת בכדי לוודא שהכסף מגיע למי שבאמת נזקק לו. לצורך כך, עמדתי בקשר עם גורמים רשמיים בקטר שהבינו את הצורך הישראלי, ואני מודה להם על כך.
Meantime, fighting apparently on multiple fronts. Syrian air defenses reportedly battling off an alleged Israeli aggression. Syrian military sources claiming that the IDF fired a burst of missiles from the southeast Beirut area late on Thursday night. The volley aimed towards targets near Homs and the Damascus countryside. Israeli army brass, however, refusing to comment on the strikes as per typical policy. Now, joining me with more on the weekend escalations between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, Dr. Ephraim Inbar. Dr. Inbar, thank you so much for being with us. Now, let's start with the Qatari aid for Gaza. Defense Minister Gantz saying that Israel and Qatar have agreed to a plan to funnel $100 in salaries to 100,000 families through the UN and the UN World Food Program. That's roughly $10 million per month. How does the UN get its list, though, of recipients? How well does this plan actually ensure that Hamas won't get its hands on the funding?
Well, actually, the list probably reflects the more needy people in Gaza. But there is no way to prevent Hamas from going to those people that they know receive money and taking their cut. I think it's very naive to believe that giving them money, Hamas will not take a percentage out of this money.
Was it useless to try then? I mean, all this back and forth with Qatar over how to bring the money into Gaza, are you saying that it was futile, that Israel maybe should have just barred the money outright?
No, we should not disperse any money. I think that we should tell the Hamas people that they should behave, and before they behave, they do not get any money. And what actually happened, they got the money and they continue to do what they've done before.
there's no way that you can think of to at least try and bring some of those funds to the people who really do deserve it?
I think we tried, and probably some money out of the $100 reaches some families, but there is no way because Hamas is ruling over Gaza and over its inhabitants. If a Gaza official comes with a gun to a needy family and tells them, listen, we arrange for you $100, I take $25 because this is what you owe Hamas, what are they going to do?
All right. Now, I want to move to the clashes between Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza and Israel. Negotiations are right now ongoing between Israel and Hamas via Egypt. How might these riots affect those negotiations?
Well, I'm sure the Egyptians are pressuring Hamas to stop those demonstrations. But we shouldn't forget that the DNA of Hamas is mukawama. It's trying to harm Israel as long as possible. They hold the flame of resistance against Israel, and we'll see them continuing what's part of their DNA. We can minimize some of those demonstrations, but we definitely cannot eliminate them because there is a great motivation to continue to do what Hamas promised to do and what it is living for.
All right. Staying on the riots now, I want to discuss the staff sergeant who unfortunately was shot in the head at point-blank range. We saw the harrowing footage of that attack through his sniper hole earlier. I understand, especially seeing these visuals, that hundreds of Palestinians are basically rushing the border, but how did they get this close to an Israeli soldier that they could nearly steal his weapon and shoot him point-blank range? How does that happen?
Somebody on the Israeli side didn't do its job. I think we shouldn't have allowed so many Palestinians, or not even one, to get close to a fence. Any fence or any obstacle is useless if there is no firing zone, and we should make sure that no Palestinian gets close to the fence or to the wall within 100 meters. We can decide 50 meters, 150 meters, and we should use fire and other means in order to prevent the Palestinians from getting close to the wall and endangering Israeli soldiers, as it just happened yesterday.
So you do see this as a outside of the box scenario, something that is very rare to occur? Because I mean, I'm struggling to understand how this happened. What lapse in the IDF judgment or a chain of command or action could have allowed this?
I'm also struggling to understand this type of tactical mistake. I think the IDF should look at the situation closely and do some homework in order to prevent this type of incidents.
All right, Dr. Ephraim Inbar, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Moving on to coronavirus now, the infection rate dropping slightly to 5.4% from 6% over the weekend, and the number of serious cases likewise beginning to plateau. But the decline in infections is not yet a full-on trend. Health ministry officials therefore still weighing imposing limitations on the size of family gatherings for the coming high holidays in September. Also, the scenes in Israel's ICUs still heartbreaking, with vaccine refusers continuing to take up the majority of beds in intensive care. Exasperated and exhausted healthcare workers, for their part, describing patients' horrible deathbed regrets.
We see a big difference between the vaccinated and non-vaccinated patients. These are patients that need help in their everyday life activities. There are patients that they're usually 70 years old and older, and their disease is usually more stable. They come, they need oxygen, they are sick, but they do not deteriorate. We don't see the big falls that we see with the unvaccinated patients. So this is really the big difference between the groups.
Joining me with more is Director of the School of Public Health at Ben-Gurion University and Interim Chair at the Association of Public Health Physicians, Professor Nadav Davidovich. Professor, thanks so much for being with us again. Now, we are now at the highest serious case number since the start of the fourth wave. How significant is that, and where do we stand right now?
So indeed, there is a wide community transmission, but if we look on the Ministry of Health dashboard, I think there are several signs that can give us some optimism. First of all, the percentage of those who are positive now come stable. It's around 5%. During January, with the widespread, we were about 9%. Also, the R coefficient was reduced from about 1.4 to below 1.2. And in general, we see that less, those who are vaccinated and over 60, they are less in severe conditions. I think all of this, including the rate of multiplication that was reduced, it was for several weeks up to 10 days, now it's more. This is showing us that we are in the right direction. This is, of course, because of the vaccination rates, especially the third dose. Even the first dose now, after several months that people were not going, now we have several thousand of them every day, but vaccinations are not enough. There are other factors. We see the green pass, use of masks that is improving, enforcement. Only with a multi-layer system we can actually get together in solidarity. Entering the opening of schools and the high holidays, we are facing, big challenges, but I'm much more positive now that we can escape lockdown.
All right, so that actually brings me to my next question. I know that you are against another lockdown, but do you see us heading that direction at this point anyway? As I mentioned before, we have the COVID czar, Nachman Ash. He's talking about potential limitations on the sizes of gatherings for, probably limited to the nuclear family if I were to venture a guess for the coming high holidays. Do you see these as being necessary?
I think that all of us already know, and we need to be smart. I canceled 2 flights abroad that were not necessary, could do it finally online. Also with family gathering in the high holidays, probably to be better not to have large family gatherings, and also preparing for prayers. And again, prayers are an important factor. This is also things that we don't need to wait for the government. We can be smart enough to prepare. And I think that having some limitation would be advisable, but not going into lockdown, especially not things like not going over 100 meters or 500 meters, not going to the parks, not going to the sea. All of these and keeping the country as open as possible would be an option if we continue with the current sense of urgency that was not there until a few weeks ago.
All right, now I want to come back to the ICUs because Israeli intensive care units are increasingly filling up with unvaccinated patients in terms of the serious symptoms. Have you personally had any experience with some of the so-called regretful patients, those who are now admitting to their nursing staff that they really do regret not having gotten vaccinated?
Yes, actually, we're even sometimes trying to get to them, and sometimes they get to us, acting as ambassadors, regretting about their choice not to be vaccinated. Sometimes people are dying, so then unfortunately, of course, they're not with us anymore, and sometimes their families are going out. I think there is a change now in the atmosphere, and if you go out to the city squares, you see something that very different. Unfortunately, between April and July, we lost lots of time. There was no sense of urgency. People felt that COVID is over. COVID won't be over. We need to learn with it, not in a sense that we need to be passive. We need to be very active and also learn from COVID to other diseases that things can be prevented. And if we are going to invest in the healthcare system and also in other public, infrastructure like welfare, community resilience, I think this is the main message I'm taking for the future challenges.
All right, Professor Nadav Davidovich, thank you very, very much for joining us again.
Thank you.
In other news, Israelis over 40 now eligible for their third COVID vaccine booster shots, and the effects of the boosters thus far are very encouraging. The rate of serious new infections continuing to fall, despite infections in general continuing slightly to rise.
So we had the 60s, 50s, now 40s. We're giving them third vaccines, and I think it's the only way to get out of the pandemic and the only way to finish with all of this. And I think everybody needs to come and do it as soon as it's possible.
We believe that the third booster shot is important to overcome the waning immunity that we see among the elderly who have received their shots over 5 months ago, and in order to properly mitigate the impact of the Delta variant on the Israeli population in view of the ensuing rates of infection and the increasing rates of severe morbidity that are threatening to reach the surge capacity of our hospital system in a month or so.
Meantime, although already using Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines, Israel's still testing its own homegrown concoction, Life, created by the IIBR, which is under the Defense Ministry's umbrella. And high doses of the drug, currently in clinical trials, may provide even longer-term protections than the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine that most Israelis have received. But arguably most importantly is not vaccines at all. Israeli researchers also still testing a COVID treatment, which if proven effective could render the virus virtually toothless. Mesencure by Bonus Bio Group, now heading for phase 2 clinical trials, with any interested Israeli and Greek hospitals invited to join in. And the results so far looking incredible, with 88% of serious patients released from hospital within just days of receiving their last dose of the drug. The drug, discovered to reduce inflammation and alleviate respiratory symptoms, among other issues caused by COVID-19. Most impressively, at least 90% of the patients aged 45 to 75 also had comorbidities. Shifting gears, the Holocaust has played no small role in the ethos of the modern Jewish people, especially in the minds of the remaining victims and their children, known as second-generation survivors. But how have these victims' unique perspectives shifted in the modern era, where the concentration camps, sites of immeasurable suffering and cruelty, now serve as tourism destinations? Well, this is exactly the focus of a newly published study in the Journal of Heritage Tourism. And joining me now with the insights is co-author of the study, consumer behavior expert and assistant professor, Vili Abraham. Vili, it's great to have you back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so my opening question, what are the biggest findings of this study?
Well, I've conducted this study with two co-authors from the University of Central Florida, Abraham Pizam and Marcos Medeiros. And what we wanted to do is first of all, it's a unique study in the sense that no other study explored the attitudes of second-generation survivors. Most of them focus on first-generation survivors. And we wanted to know what are the motivating factors. Why would they go or not go visit a memorial site or museum like Auschwitz and Birkenau, the memorial and museum?
Right.
What we realized that the major motivating factor was discovery, to discover what happened, to feel identity with the place, to go into, to try to experience what other people may have experienced, especially if you're talking about, your parents who,
right.
Were
and
there.
To get to know them better, because a lot of first-generation survivors weren't very talkative of their experiences.
Exactly, yeah. So we wanted to know what motivates them. So it's definitely discovery. However, what was especially interesting is that although the level of interest in the place was so high, the level of animosity was lower as far as averages are concerned. But as far as
towards whom?
Towards Poland. Towards Poland. On a scale of 1 to 7, the average is 4.1 more or less, which is more or less in the middle, but it's still quite high.
Okay.
Because although the average is lower than the desire to discover about the place, although it's on average it's slower, but it had a much greater impact. So the second generation Holocaust survivors who harbor animosity towards Poland see the place as not attractive as a tourist destination, and as a result they have no desire to visit Poland.
How, especially now with everything that's going on with Poland, they recently passed the bill that basically banned, but by default, it banned all of the cases for retaking property rights and property claims and things like that that were seized during the Holocaust. And that really comes just a couple years after Poland had that whole Polish death camps law, where they, were removing the word Polish from that sentence to distance themselves from the Nazi regime and complicity with the Nazi regime. So how does Poland's recent actions fit into the findings of your study?
Well, we conducted the study obviously a lot before this current diplomatic discord. Had we done it today, I'm almost 100% sure that the animosity would have increased significantly. It's hard to say how much, but probably out of a scale of 1 to 7, it would have been 5 or even 6. When you look at historic relationships, if you look at the relationship between China and Japan, that the Japanese massacred 300,000 Chinese citizens during World War II.
Yeah.
Exactly, and every time there's a diplomatic discord between the two countries, the animosity peaks. And then it decreases, and then it peaks. But overall, there's still much animosity between Chinese and Japan. And I would also expect that in the case of, us and Poland, second-generation survivors are probably having all of those memories and flashbacks coming, and definitely the animosity would go up significantly.
All right, Vili Abraham, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
All right, and if you'd like to see the full interview with Vili Abraham about his new published piece on dark tourism, and the thoughts of Holocaust survivors on dark tourism, please check it out at ILTV.tv or on YouTube or on our Facebook channel. And now it's time to return to Tokyo for the latest of the 2020-2021 Summer Olympic Games. But this time we're covering the Paralympic competition, where 33 incredible Israeli athletes are soon set to participate. ILTV's Chana Rifkin with the details.
יש בנו, בכל אדם, כוחות עצומים שלפעמים האדם לא מודע להם, והיציאה שלכם לאולימפיאדה ובכלל העשייה שלכם סביב כל ימות השנה מבטאת את זיהוי הכוחות וחשיפת הכוחות שנמצאים בתוכנו, וזה באמת ההשראה לכולנו.
The Tokyo Olympics continuing now with the Paralympic Games, and Israel sending 33 athletes, mostly women, to compete across 11 different sports. The nearly 2-week competition set to begin on Tuesday, August 24. Meantime, no less impressive than the previous delegation, the Israeli Paralympic team also boasting some serious heavy hitters, several of whom expected to come home with medals, especially as several athletes already have multiple Olympic medals to their names.
יש לכם עכשיו תחרות קשה מאוד עם המשלחת שחזרה מטוקיו, אז חבר'ה, הם קבעו סטנדרט גבוה. אין מצב שאתם מביאים פחות מדליות זהב מהם, אין מצב.
In fact, nearly half of the Israeli team returning to the Paralympics for at least the second time. And unlike the earlier Israeli delegation, this team, including an Israeli Arab and 2 Israeli Druze. As for which competitions Israelis will compete in, the list this year including rowing, shooting, bocce ball, swimming, badminton, goalball, paracanoeing, table tennis, wheelchair tennis, powerlifting, and finally, track and field athletics.
אז אני סומך עליכם, אבל לא מנסה להלחיץ אתכם. תדעו שאנחנו מאחוריכם, גם בטוב, גם ברגעים הפחות טובים. אנחנו גאים בכם, מאמינים בכם, עם שלם מסתכל עליכם וגאה בכם. אז תודה רבה.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Meteorologists are calling for a mixture of clouds and clear skies this evening and daytime tomorrow, Monday. Tonight's lows between 20 to 27 degrees Celsius. And then tomorrow, temperatures ranging from 28 to 39 degrees Celsius. Quite a jump. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.24 shekels to the American dollar and 2.53 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.